interested in a
Oh.
different guest.
Okay, it should be coming up any second.
Is Senator Bruce with us yet?
I
Says
can't
now we're live
tell
on
right now.
YouTube.
Yep, we're live.
Okay, so I guess, okay, great.
Okay,
And
well-
Senator Bruce, yes, he just, yep. Okay, and there's somebody there that's trying to get in and I don't know who they are. They didn't give me their phone number.
Okay.
Should I let them in, Matt?
No, not if you don't know who they are. And
Can they
try to-
send you an email?
I just don't know who they are. That's the problem.
Can they
Maybe
send
all
you
here.
an email saying who they are?
They can if they, yeah, if they, maybe they will if they can't get in. Maybe they'll realize and then they'll email me. That could happen. But we are live, guys, so go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Our first witness today is Senate Judiciary, remotely working. I'm jealous of all the members who have thousands of books behind them. Can't see all my books. We're going to start with Jim Baker, Commissioner of the Department of Corrections, to give us an update on the COVID-19 issues that the department is facing. I know that we've read in the news a few things, but Jim, if you could update us, please.
Sure. For the record, it's Jim Baker, the Interim Commissioner of Corrections, and good morning to everybody.
You notice I didn't use that term interim.
Yeah, I guess I don't know, Senator. I guess April 30th probably is not going to work. So since we're public, I guess my wife will now know that. So yeah. So look, I won't go over everything we've done in preparation, but you've all, I tried to get the key committee leaders when we found out that we had an inmate test positive at the Northwest facility. The inmate started presenting symptoms. We followed the protocol that we had put in place that I had briefed you on before. And, again, the staff had worked very hard. And that pandemic protocol is being updated almost daily based upon guidance from Dr. Levine's shop and from CDC and the best practices coming out of the national associations around correctional organizations. So the inmate was immediately isolated when he presented symptoms and tested. He tested positive. Now, leading up to that, we had 3 staff members at that facility test positive. The first one had very limited access to inmates. The second one had a little bit more access to inmates, but in a given section inside the jail. The second staff member that tested positive is very ill. Is a corrections officer. I don't want to get too far into this because I need to protect privacy, but is in an ICU unit since last Saturday night. When I got the call on Sunday, I was not optimistic that we were going to be able to save him. Excuse me. I want to report, though, that in the last few days, his condition has improved greatly. He's still in ICU. So I ask people for your prayers and thoughts. He is in very difficult position, but I think he's turned a corner, and we're just thankful for the medical staff that's treating him right now. The other two staff members are quarantined at home, and they're showing less severe symptoms. The inmate is showing less severe symptoms and is being treated in the negative pressure room at the Northwest facility. Based upon that, and I will say again, the leadership at Northwest was following all our protocols, cleaning, maintaining the facility. I know there's been reports about lack of soap and water. I've double checked that and triple checked it. I don't want to get into a situation where I'm saying information was false, but in this time of fear and the unknown, people are reporting stuff, and you got to chase it down to the ground to make sure that what I'm hearing as a commissioner is true. So that inmate is now in the negative pressure room. We're going to be able to deal with that inmate on the ground in the facility with the medical staff that is there. After that occurred overnight into yesterday, a call within Human Services with Secretary Smith, we made the decision to test everybody inside the facility. The health department, under the leadership of Dr. Levine, helped us greatly. UVM stepped up greatly to help us. And we conducted 156 tests last night. We're going to finish those tests today with the great assistance of the state police in Vermont and the Massachusetts State Police. We set up a relay of those kits from St. Albans to the Mass line, and the Mass State Police took them right into Boston to be tested immediately. Because our fear, as you can imagine, is that if we've got other folks inside that facility, we need to know now. And we have locked the facility down. This is not what we wanted to do. It was really our last option, because as you all can appreciate, when you lock folks down, it raises the stress inside the facility greatly. We have folks locked down and we're following the guidelines, which would be if one of you were tested and positive, you would go into a 14-day quarantine. The challenge for us is we're tracking back the best we can using the health department epidemiologists to figure out contact the best we can, put the best time frame in place, and we'll quarantine the facility from 14 days from there to contain the spread. So we have stepped up the monitoring of everybody in the facility by checking temperatures every shift. We have the right equipment on the ground now with the infrared testing, the temperature gauges to do that. And so that's where we are in that facility. And right now, we only have one other inmate that we're testing that came up yesterday, and it's at the South Burlington facility. It's one of our female inmates, and that female inmate is in isolation along with their roommate. Now, isolation, when we talk about medical isolation and quarantine, two different terms, we've got them separated out from the population right now until we get the test back. And if the test comes back positive, we'll deal with that situation with our medical staff. Those are the only incidents we have right now. We have several staff members across the state, more because of their outside life, are being tested, and we're waiting to hear back. And so right now we have a total of, I think it's 4 or 5 staff members that are positive. Some of them are not in facilities, they're in the district offices. And so we are keeping them, following the guidelines by leaving them out of work, and we've stepped up our monitoring of our staff. So every day when staff comes in, we're monitoring them. We have a new questionnaire that was developed with the assistance of the Vermont Health Department, and we're screening people when they're coming to work. And if there's any signs that they're exhibiting symptoms, we're sending them home.
Good.
I think that's, in a nutshell, the important piece of what we're doing right now. We're continuing to do the rest of what we've been doing. I will say to you that in the last week and a half, through some work of our logistics section, folks that are working feverishly, we've opened up a pretty good supply line now of supplies between the state EOC and what we're able to locate out on the market ourselves. We are pretty much stocked for 30 days of PPE that we're holding, and we have a pretty elaborate delivery system set up. The hand sanitizer was a challenge. We ran out in some of the facilities. We had to replace or encourage people to use soap and hand washing, but we just got connected with 2 different distilleries in Vermont where they're going to deliver us. One distillery is going to start delivering us 50 gallons in a 50-gallon drum, and we've set up our own assembly line where we've gotten jugs, and our probation and parole officers are going to fill them and get them to the facilities. And then the other piece is we have masked up everybody inside. The EOC was able to deliver us 1,000 masks immediately the other night when the inmate tested positive. So we have directed staff and inmates to wear masks, and we're slowly getting that throughout the system. The other 5 facilities are in a modified lockdown where we're controlling the movement best we can in the facilities until we get a handle on Northwest and we get a handle on the sole inmate in South Burlington. And then the last piece is we've set up a pretty elaborate sewing system, and we're creating our own masks from sheets and old uniforms. We're using rubber bands and sewing machines and staple guns, and we're hoping to have those out to the facilities so everybody has at least 2 masks, because they really should be washed every 8 hours, and that's from CDC guidelines. So that's
Thank you,
where we
Jim.
are. And,
Mr. Chair,
Yeah, yes, Phil?
if I could just make a comment and then ask a question.
Yes.
Back last month, when the commissioner came to speak to us, I asked if there was a plan to test everybody, and we were told there were not enough tests. And obviously, had we done it then, we'd be in a different position now. So I think of that as a failure on the federal level, that we were not able to get the tests. Now you're in the process of testing at Northwest. I'm wondering, is there an aggressive plan to test every inmate, or is it just to deal with in a reactionary way when somebody shows symptoms in another prison?
well, look, I'll stand by what I told you a month ago, Senator, that the test kits weren't available. And quite honestly, we probably tapped into a supply of test kits now that were for other possibilities to get this done in Northwest. And yes, it is reactionary, but I would also say to you that because of the nature of the population of employees we have there, it's hard to tell where this came from. And we're trying to do some work now with the health department to pin that down. So for example, one theory could be we have a pretty significant number of corrections officers that work at Northwest that live in Clinton County, New York. We've been in conversation with, our director of nursing has been in conversation with the Department of Health in Clinton County, and they've got in Clinton County, New York, an unusual number of cases have been confirmed. So I hear what you said to me, but we still could have a carrier coming into a facility, even when you test. They could come in after the test, and you're going to keep trying to test to try to stay ahead of that. That
No,
makes sense to you.
I understand.
Part of the
I
decision
understand.
we're making, right?
I understand that. But what I'm saying is, if our policy is to play catch up behind identified victims rather than to be proactive system wide, then we're basically, our plan is to fail, right? We're only going to test.
I would challenge you on the word fail, Senator. I don't think our staff is working as hard as they are every day. to fail.
Can I make clear, Phil, and from my perspective, when all of this is written and said is done, on the federal level, the failure to provide the testing that is necessary to do the job, whether it be in a corrections institution, a nursing home, soldier's home, whatever, is the failure, is why this got so far out of hand. I think that you will, so I didn't think your criticism was of the Department of Corrections.
It wasn't, and I made clear at the beginning of my
Right.
remarks that I thought it was a federal problem. But now where we are is, as I understand it, we're testing aggressively in a facility where we've identified somebody with
Yep.
COVID-19, but we're not in the other facilities until the outbreaks there occur. And I just
I
think,
don't know.
given
Okay.
the small number of inmates in Vermont, I don't understand why we're not pushing for a system-wide testing policy right now.
Because what I would say to you, Senator, is that we could test today, and a corrections officer could come in who is asymptomatic as a carrier, and again, we would have to be testing the facilities like every 7 days.
Well, but
In order to stay ahead of it. What's that?
if I could respond,
Yes.
what I would say is, if you tested everyone today and everyone was negative, then yes, I understand what you're saying. If you test the other facilities and you find 12 people who are positive, that's obviously putting us in a much better place than waiting
Yeah,
for.
I agree. But our focus right now is to contain what we know And quite honestly, in a lot of conversations with lessons learned coming out of nursing homes in Chittenden County, I'm depending on the guidance coming from the health experts too, about what we should be doing and what we shouldn't be doing. And so we're focused right now on containing that inside Northwest. And I hear your point. I certainly will discuss it. That would be a very heavy lift to try to do that and get the necessary test kits that we would need to do to collect the samples. The other thing that I failed to mention to all of you is that we have also secured hotels around every facility, and we're offering our staff to stay at the hotels off duty because they're very concerned about their exposure to the virus, bringing it home to their families. So we're expending a significant amount of resources to be able to set up those hotels, and our staff is starting to take advantage of that.
Thank you. Jim, I've got a couple of questions.
Sure.
One is clearly in a group setting like a prison, people might be reluctant to talk about their health because they know they're going to be placed in isolation, which
Right.
some have said is like segregation.
Right.
So has that been discussed at all? And are we making moves to make sure that
So,
it's not segregation or punishment?
yeah, look, we have no other choice but use what was segregation as the place where we're isolating. I mean, we don't, I've had this conversation with a couple of the advocates, Senator, our facilities are what our facilities are. We have to use the best we can what the makeup of the facility is. And, this was kind of the subject of a VPR story about inmates are going into isolation and they're going into the segregation units. And that's exactly right. That's what they were used for before. But we don't have the luxury of creating something else inside the facilities to be able to segregate, to use the segregation as an isolation. And I've been emphasizing to the staff, we're talking about medical isolation. It's not segregation. To get over your point, we have stepped up surveillance and we're asking medical staff to check. We finally have enough of the infrared handheld thermometers where you don't have to be invasive by sticking in I know you've all probably heard it, seen it, because they're a hot item on the market right now, where we can use an infrared to check temperatures, because temperatures are one of the first clues that you got something going on.
Yep.
So we've stepped up surveillance, and we're doing that on a regular basis several times during the course of the day. Because we are hearing that some of the inmates may not report symptoms.
Jim, you've dropped the population. The last time I saw was down to 1,458 in-state.
It's I think today's count is 1421.
So it indicates at least that every effort's been made to move people out that could be moved out by the department anyway.
Right.
At some point, we ought to talk about how this got done, but I know you've heard from a lot of advocates and I have
Right.
as well.
Right.
And I know that in many cases it would take a state's attorney or judiciary or
Correct.
someone else to move individuals out, but you feel you've moved everybody out who could be.
There's a staffing meeting today. The regular weekly staffing meeting is going on, I think, literally right now. And they'll be reviewing more cases. I will say to you that some of the folks that we've put out, probably under normal conditions, we would be violating them because we are having some challenges with the population we put out because we did take some risks that we normally wouldn't take to try to thin out the population. But for the most part, it seems to be working. And let me just address the medical piece because I asked for these stats yesterday. So I think the number I saw this morning, don't hold me to this, was 1421, down from 1672 on March 25th. And out of the population that's left, I asked for the number of folks that are medically challenged. the medically challenged folks that fit into some of the criteria of high risk in our system right now, out of people that are left, is around 620. That's a huge number. And so I get a lot of requests every day from families because of COVID-19, who want their family member released because of health conditions. And one of the deciding factors are, what's their underlying offense and what's the history of violence, and what's the history of victimization.
Yep.
So we continue to look at the population, and I'll say it again, some of this is the courts have slowed down, people aren't coming in. We've cut down significantly on what our tolerance level is around violations, and some of that will have to shift back later. And so who knows what the number is, but I do think it would be worth a conversation when we get to the other end of this dark tunnel, Senator, where we got some light that we can talk about how we did this.
Agree.
And I continue to talk with Ellen and the folks at CSG as we're going through this. I try to chat with them every once in a while to keep up to speed on what we're doing and make sure it's got some measurement against best standards.
Thank you. Senator White has a question, but I know it may be about visitation.
Yeah, Senator, I saw that email. Can you, because of the modified lockdown, can I get back to you directly on that?
Senator
Yes.
White, you want to be specific about did I get it right?
Well, I've just got these emails, and I think that they might be referring to federal policies, but they're talking about what is the visitation policy now for
Yeah,
in terms of video and phone calls, since they
it's
can.
it was up until this lockdown, right? It was 1 25-minute video free visit with a family member and 2 5-minute calls a week.
Okay,
So I saw that email this morning. I just caught up with it. Some of that may change just because of the modified lockdowns, but I will get back to you on that.
thank you.
Okay.
Other questions for Colonel Baker? For Commissioner Baker?
That was, believe it or not, Senator, that was 11 years ago.
Well,
Next month.
I see Colonel Birmingham's
Is
online, so.
Is the good Colonel on?
I am, and you can have this job back anytime you want, Colonel.
Well, listen, we can trade anytime you want, Colonel. You can come on over to corrections.
I didn't say trade. I said you could have this one back.
Listen, Senators, the Colonel's on the line. I want to give him a big shout out. Last night, his staff was unbelievable setting these relays up to get these kits down into Massachusetts, to Boston, to get tested. And we tied up a lot of his resources to get this done last night, and I appreciate it.
I wish you could connect the Patriots truck to come up with the masks, by the way.
We'll try to work. I think Mass State Police may have connections on that, Senator. We'll try to work on that next.
Thank you, Jim. And
I do have to
stay,
jump on the call with Dr. Levine, so if anybody's got any follow-up from what I talked about, please email and I'll get back to you.
thank you.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you very much. We had David Scher up next. Yeah, okay.
I just wanted to apologize. Apparently my flipping the pages was causing a lot of static out there, so I'm apologizing and I'll stop flipping pages.
We wanted to get in Colonel Birmingham and I believe Heather Pellman and Ted Brady are here to talk about the enforcement order. But I first wanted to talk about the enforcement order and how it's impacting the lodging industry throughout Vermont. To get an idea, I was struck by the number of hotels and motels in my area of the state that were non-compliant when the state police went and checked. So I guess people are trying to understand. The other thing is that a lot of times people are now reporting people for not being socially distant or not. I don't know who they're reporting it to. Maybe it's the state police, local police, whatever. And I saw a case in Rhode Island where people went to play golf at a Rhode Island golf course and they lived in Massachusetts. So they each got fined $1,000 for violating the Rhode Island order. And I'm just wondering how we're enforcing all these different rules. But to start with, just mainly the lodging industry. And I just got a notice from my local Hampton Inn that there's zero basically guests, but they are providing free rooms for medical personnel that, and what Colonel Baker was just describing. So, do you want to start, David, with what you're doing to the lodging industry and Airbnbs and others?
Sure, I can start with that, and others on the line can fill in as well.
Yeah, if we could use more of a round table here with Helen, Ted, and Colonel Birmingham too as well. So
Sure. So I'll just briefly say what we've been doing and then turn it over. We certainly have been part of the effort on education and bringing people into compliance around the state. Our criminal division called around to all lodging places that were known to be non-compliant. This was a few days ago now, and the list is changing, I know, every day. And so we've been working on that end, and I know folks have been going around to check more. It's not a black and white issue. It's not an open or closed issue, because as you just pointed out, Senator, and as others have mentioned, there are allowable uses for lodging in hotels under the executive order and addenda. And the other piece that we've worked on is with Airbnb and the short-term rental market. And we've been working to make sure that those listings are, it's a little unclear how it's going to be handled, but probably just taken down. And again, if Ted Brady or anybody else in the line has more recent information on that, I happily defer. But we did reach out to them and legal counsel for some of those entities to try to have a uniform approach that would just be a blanket application around Vermont. And so that's where we were, that's the work that we were doing in our office, and I'll turn it over to some other folks.
well, one of the things I've heard too is that, and maybe someone can respond to this, is they're trying to comply now, but the idea that they couldn't take reservations for the fall that are conditional is also troubling to many of them. They're afraid that some people are doing it and they're going to be at the advantage when this is using Colonel Baker's language, at the end of the tunnel. Who knows what will happen in the fall foliage season, but that certainly is a time that they're looking at. Could we be taking reservations? So maybe you can, would that be in violation too? And that was one of the questions.
Right. And again, I'll check in. The committee should check in with ACC as well on this. I mean, our read, I should say, of the order as it stands is that taking reservations for any time period is not allowable. I think that I think that's certainly something that we could think more about as time goes on. But right now, I do believe that it is not allowable to take reservations for any time period.
Colonel, do you have anything to add in terms of the enforcement? I know that it was state troopers that went out, or I assume it was state troopers.
It was all law enforcement, Senator. So can everybody hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay. So there's been two memos of guidance issued, one by Commissioner Sherling and one by the Attorney General. I forwarded it to you, Senator, for the committee. The general posture on guidance to law enforcement is voluntary compliance and education. And we're taking that approach with all violations or suspected violations of the executive order. When we went out to do the lodging checks, that was really an information gathering. It was not an enforcement mechanism. It was all law enforcement in the state. We have since been trying to work with the non-compliant lodging facilities. All of the information that we receive is gathered centrally and forwarded to the Attorney General's office for enforcement. So we just completed a call before this call with all the chiefs and sheriffs and state law enforcement leaders with the Attorney General and his staff, just to touch base on some of the things that have come up that you've been talking about on this call, including gatherings of people on the street corner, lodging establishments, houses of worship, a lot of things that are covered by the order, but that are kind of coming up through reports from the public to law enforcement. The general posture from the Attorney General is it's kind of a tiered process. We will always, always, always attempt to resolve all of these issues with voluntary compliance and education. If not, then those issues will be pushed to his office for review. They will then make determinations on whether they're going to attempt some sort of civil process. Obviously, at the very end, which nobody wants to use and nobody is even thinking about using, is the criminal penalties. But they are at the end of the long process throughout the entire enforcement mechanism here. So I'd be happy to answer any questions about that, if there are any.
Senator Benning's first. Yep.
Senator Sears, can I interrupt for 1 second? Colonel, I posted both of those on the website. Is that okay? I really never even thought about it because I post all documents.
No, they're public documents.
Okay, great. Just want to be sure. I got a little nervous there.
Yeah, Senator Benning.
So Colonel, one of my constituents is a select board member in the town of Topsom. He's a contractor by trade. Yesterday, he was working on a house that he is remodeling. It's a vacant house at the end of a dirt road. His crew consisted of his son and his brother. A state police officer showed up and told him to shut down. That makes no sense to me whatsoever, given circumstances. And David, while you're on the line here, I would very much like to know why that would be deemed a violation in such a way that he felt threatened and is being told to essentially stop his work altogether when there isn't any possible way under that group of people being gathered at the end of a dirt road that they're going to be impacting the spread of this virus in some fashion. I'm amazed first that a state police officer went to the end of a dirt road to find this guy and tell him to shut down. But is it the intention of the Attorney General to start issuing criminal citations to people like that?
No, it's not our intention to do that. And one thing that I want to reiterate that the Colonel did state clearly, but I want to make it plain from the Attorney General's office standpoint as well. We are approaching this the exact same way that the Department of Public Safety is and the administration is, which is this is an education first operation, education first enforcement policy. We're not looking to bring court action in any of these cases. It may be the case that in certain isolated instances, there are people who are continually refusing to comply and in doing so are putting people at risk. And there may be a case where an enforcement action might take place. I think that we certainly would be going to a civil enforcement action first. Criminal enforcement action is really, really the last, a last resort in extreme circumstances. But even I would say civil enforcement action is the second to last resort, let's put it that way. We're really trying to work cooperatively with people, and in putting forward our directive and our guidance, we really tried to make clear that this is working hand in hand with the intention of the Department of Public Safety and the governor to have an education first approach to this. So I want to be very clear on that. But part of education is talking with people and letting them know what the rules are and what the guidance is. Certainly, the governor's stay-at-home, stay-safe order starts from a standpoint of people need to be staying at home in order to allow our public health system to keep up with this health emergency. And it goes from there to allow for certain exceptions. Sort of builds off that baseline. The baseline is stay at home, stay safe. From that baseline, we build certain exceptions into it, saying, all right, there are certain essential businesses that need to operate and certain functions that need to be allowed to happen in order for people to stay safe, including things like food distribution, public health workers, and so forth. But certainly the approach here is an education approach, and putting forward our directive, there was no intention to indicate that there's anything other than that. We tried to make that clear in the directive and make it clear since then. And I would say that, we're really trying to work closely, and we have worked closely with the Department of Public Safety in terms of how we approach this.
I just want to be clear because I told him that I was going to bring this question up. And I
Colonel?
want to be able to go back to him and say that I spoke to you on this call and that I've got some answer for him. And I'm not sure that I heard an answer from you yet.
Well, that maybe Ted Brady can after.
Senator,
Ted?
can I just
Yeah,
address
go
this?
ahead, Colonel. Yep.
Not knowing the situation, Senator, I would have to assume that we get a lot of reports from the public about violations. So our stance currently is, if we received a report from the public about a violation, a trooper will respond to investigate and educate. Now, I don't know if that was the case in the situation you brought up. Construction did come up in the phone call with the Attorney General and the chiefs this morning. There are limitations on construction in the executive order. I don't have it in front of me, so I can't cite it exactly. But I can only imagine that they were acting on the order and what was prohibited in the order as it relates to home construction.
Ted, did you want to comment?
I think the Colonel just nailed it. The order does not exempt construction as in-person to continue in-person operations. The only construction that may continue is construction for the purpose of the COVID-19 response. This has been a source of a lot of complaints to us. We issued guidance that specifically says construction is residential construction, commercial construction is non-essential for the purposes of this stay home, stay safe order. We've gotten a lot of feedback from contractors that work alone or in low contact issues. So you have a contractor, it sounds exactly like you're describing, Senator Benning, who only has 1 or 2 people on their job site. They can practice social distancing. But as David mentioned, the number one thing is we're asking people to stay home. And those contractors leaving their home have to stop and get gas. They have to stop and get supplies. They have to go use a bathroom. They use a communal porta potty. They go use the local convenience store. So we've interpreted it and we've issued guidance that says that shall not occur. And we understand that that's a really hard pill to swallow if you're a person that goes and works alone all day. And the governor's office, the attorney general's office, our office are all talking about what the right guidance there is going forward. But right now we have that really strict interpretation that I hope you can convey to your constituent that that's why it exists. We're asking people to stay home, but I know that's not enough because it is so hard to swallow.
Well, my understanding is that hardware stores have been able to stay open for the very reason of getting some of these contractors' materials. So if I'm hearing you both correctly, or all three of you correctly, this is something that's going to have to be dealt with from a little higher up on the chain of command. And I guess I'll take it up there next. I'm hoping that if I go to my law office and I'm the only one there, I'm not going to have a state police officer show up on my doorstep and either educating me or threaten me, depending on how I see it as his delivery. But
yeah, so
I guess that's where we are.
The definition of in-person business operations is anytime you have to go and interact with another human being. So
and that's, I understand that. I have not been doing that in my law office. I didn't think this contractor was doing that where he was either. And
There's
given
all
that
kinds
hardware
of-
stores are open, I think
Yeah.
we have an issue that needs to be dealt with a little higher up the chain of command, I guess.
But this is where there's a lot of misinterpretation. I wanted to move over to the lodging, but Senator White has a question.
No, I just wanted to say that we have to address the same issue around landscapers, I believe. We have sent
Right.
some stuff. And one of the problems is that I got a call from, landscaping is not considered an essential business. And I got a call from a housing complex down here that is condos. And we're already in the southern part of the state having an influx of ticks. I've already had my first tick bite, and they need to keep their grass cut in order to keep the ticks down, and they all live there, and yet their landscaper has said he can't do it. So I think that that's another area where people are working alone. They're not having contact with other people, that we have to reconsider how we address it. just wanted to throw that in.
Well, it's what's essential, what's not essential. You should, I'm sure you see the news from Massachusetts about whether the marijuana shops are essential or not. Heather, getting back to lodging for a minute, what impact and what's happening with this? Some
Sure.
people are following the rules, some people may not be.
Sure. Thank you, Senator. What we're hearing from the lodging establishments is that, from the beginning of the executive order, they certainly were hit right away, as were other folks in the hospitality industry, our restaurants and so forth. We have seen that folks are complying voluntarily to the large extent. And I can also add, in terms of the online platforms for the short-term rentals, we have been successful in working with them to be able to comply with the executive order to prevent future bookings at the platform level. That didn't happen immediately, but that now is in place, so that if you went to go and try and rent a room on the Expedia platforms, which is HomeAway and VRBO, you'll see that those properties are no longer available to rent. And on Airbnb, the property still shows up, but you can't actually book for any dates. So that is a success, and that we've been able to complete that communication with those platforms to be able to make sure that folks are complying on that platform level. For licensed lodging properties throughout the state, as I mentioned, people have understand. Clearly, as with other sectors, they've been very hard hit by this, but are complying to the large extent, within also understanding that they are being called upon to provide lodging for some of those essential duties.
Thank you. That's helpful. Senator White.
So this came up this morning in our all Senate meeting, and there was the question about why people couldn't make provisional reservations for late summer and early fall. And they would have to be obviously provisional, but so that came up, and I just wondered if that's being considered.
That has definitely been an issue for the lodging, for the whole lodging community. Yes, that is under consideration right now, as to when there might be a potential to look at that again.
Thank you.
Colonel, you mentioned when Senator Benning asked the question that you're getting calls from people saying so-and-so isn't complying, or this group isn't complying with the governor's orders. When the state trooper goes out to check, what are they doing? Informing? How do they deal with it?
Yeah, our guidance to them.
Saturday, I went by the Mount Anthony Country Club. There were two guys out walking the course with their golf clubs. They were more than 6 feet apart. I wouldn't have thought to call. They weren't, the course is closed as far as I know, so I don't know that they were violating anything. So what does the trooper do?
So to answer your question, Senator, the public has been calling law enforcement all over the state, both us, locals, the sheriffs. We have established a reporting portal for the public to make it easier for them. It's on our website. And when we receive a complaint from the public about any potential violation of the executive order or non-compliance issues, law enforcement's first response is to send an officer to investigate, to gather information, to educate, inform if they believe there's a perceived violation or it's a known violation based on facts, and try and obtain voluntary compliance. If that does not work, then the reporting goes to the Attorney General's office, who then makes enforcement decisions from there.
Okay.
But yes, to answer your question, generally we are receiving complaints from the public. So, which to Senator Benning's point, I would have to assume, although I don't know for sure, that trooper must have received some sort of direction to drive out there, and it would likely have been a complaint.
That is exactly what happened. A Another member of the town decided to make a complaint. I guess they have a beef with each other. And as a result, I believe it was Trooper Schaefer who went out to, you guys are calling it educate. My constituent is telling me more of a threat. Who to believe, I don't know. But I want to make sure that at some point we get this ironed out. And David, I can trust that you and your folks are going to be talking about this. I'm going to take it to the executive branch to deal with it there as well. But it just seems to me that we can't have troopers going around the state leaving the impression that people are going to be threatened with criminal conviction. That's an awful thing. I mean, education is one thing, but you're going to experience an extreme amount of pushback from people who are doing their best to comply with the orders, but trying to survive at the same time.
And I could not agree with you more, Senator. And for the record, I do not expect any trooper ever to threaten anyone on this executive order. That would not be appropriate. And you know, unfortunately, those things may or may not happen. They will be dealt with internally.
I don't want to accuse that trooper, Colonel. I want to make sure that you do understand that I know it's all in the eye of the beholder. And in this particular set of eyes, I got word that they felt very threatened.
Understood. Just so you know, our guidance is to troopers to educate, not threaten. And I just want to make that very clear.
Sometimes it's in the eye of the beholder, and we're going to get to this a little later, is the state trucks at the border of Vermont. And even I found it somewhat intimidating to drive by these two huge snowplows parked with their lights flashing, you know, with the sign saying, if you stay in quarantine. I understand that. I fully support it, but it is somewhat, you know, it's in the eye of the beholder. And I think when a uniformed trooper comes up to you and says something, it has a certain feel to it.
Absolutely. And we're aware of that. I mean, it's a threatening and uncomfortable position. And I've reiterated to the command staff, and I will continue to reiterate that the public is under immense stress and anxiety right now. And these are not criminals. They are people who are trying very hard to keep their lives moving forward and their businesses intact, and they're wanting to do the right thing. So we have to tread very lightly. And I understand having a uniformed trooper come to your house is, no matter how they approach it, could be intimidating and threatening. We're doing our best in that regard. But it's important that you understand that we are educating our people on the fact that this is causing an immense amount of stress for everyone. And we have to handle it very carefully.
Thank you, Colonel. Senator White, final question on this.
Well, I wondered if this is the place, or if you have a on the agenda to ask about how we're dealing with day visits to parks and to the parks.
Michael Snyder, the commissioner, is going to be on a little later.
Okay, great. Thanks.
I see he just arrived. Ted and Heather, do you have any final comments on from the agency perspective?
Sure, I'd love to just reiterate the extraordinary nature of the time we're in. We've received more than 5,200 businesses contacting us in the last week, and we've issued the same guidance to all of them. And they're being asked to make really hard interpretations, but whenever we ask them to do that, we say err on the side of caution. So in our opinion, the highest and most best advice out of that executive order is to stay home. And as a result of that, a lot of people are going to economically suffer. And the federal government has implemented the largest economic stimulus package in the history of the country as a result of that. Somebody like Senator Benning's talking about for the first time would be able to get $1,000 weekly benefit through the unemployment system, because we recognize that what we've done to them is devastate their livelihood as a society, not we at ACCD. And please help educate your constituents about those tools. The fact that sole proprietors can get unemployment for the first time. The Paycheck Protection Program at SBA provides a relief for your entire payroll, including your own, for 8 weeks. So that contractor, just to use that example, his brother and his son for the first time, their entire wage, whatever they paid them last year, up to $100,000 each, is a grant from the SBA for 8 weeks through that program. That's why those programs exist. So I hope you can just help educate folks to what tools are available to them as a result of this unprecedented action we've had to take.
Ted, I don't know how far you've stayed on top of this subject, but that revenue stream has not yet kicked in and may not kick in for a couple more weeks at least. So people are automatically losing all of their income at one moment in time, and they're trying to do their best. These folks literally were not allowing anybody, and I hear this all the time, but I just want to present this as a state senator trying to represent constituents, that when the police go out, if you're educating, that's a wonderful idea. I want to make a clear understanding before we leave this conversation, though, that if you take the next step and citations are being issued, all of us are going to have a major public relations problem, and I don't want to be in that position if we can avoid it.
And I just want to mention that what I heard from those motels and hotels in Bennington that followed the rules, they were very upset that some hotels and motels weren't following the rules. Now, I didn't get all the details of what the state police found in terms of, or law enforcement found in terms of non-compliance. And I think that's going to be true throughout this whole process that Ted is talking about, where some people are playing by the rules and some people are skirting the rules. And I think that is naturally upsetting to those that are trying to follow the rules. And it's a natural human thing. I mean, I want to get seeds to plant in my garden, but there are certain stores that can sell them, certain that can't. And that's, so those are the types of things I think that we're working our way through in these certain uncharted waters. Thank you, Ted, and thank you, Heather, for joining us today. Really helpful.
Thanks.
Happy to do so.
Thank you. Judge, we wanted to move over to I'm sure the courts aren't impacted at all by the COVID-19.
No, we're just running along at our normal pace.
At
Yes.
your normal pace.
Right.
But we wanted to get an update on how good it is, how bad it is, or we've noticed a lot of cases have been, I'm noticing in the local paper, for example, people cited into court for June something or other. I'm just imagining what's going to happen on June something or other when they all show up.
So am I, Senator. Let me begin. Thank the committee for inviting me. For the record, Brian Grierson, Chief Superior Judge, and have been operating the Supreme Court's Administrative Order 49 went in effect March 17th, and which greatly reduced the scheduling of matters in the court. They provided a list of emergency proceedings that can go forward, but it's obviously a very limited list. At the present time, we're operating on reduced staff schedules, as well as obviously reduced judicial appearance in courts. There's only been one court, we haven't closed it, but we've suspended operations in the Wyndham Civil Court because of staffing shortages. There was only one person there. That person was moved over to the family criminal division. But staffing continues to be an issue. And Terry Scott, the Chief of Trial Court Operations, monitors that very closely day to day. We've had some courts particularly hard hit. Franklin County, for instance, has had a substantial reduction in staff. Orleans is also, all the courts have experienced that, but those two courts in particular. have showed a dramatic reduction. We are still operating only on emergency basis. The issue that you mentioned, Senator, is one that we're equally concerned about. Usually it is the law enforcement on direction from the state's attorneys, local state's attorneys, decide what the citation will be, what the citation date will be. If courts or judges are called after hours to set conditions of release, they may get involved in that discussion. But I would say, generally speaking, those citation dates on I'll refer to them as nonviolent offenses, are being scheduled months out. And we hope that as we move along, they stagger those dates so it doesn't all end up on the same date, else we'll really be in trouble. The more, if I can refer to them as offenses, misdemeanors, or felonies involving violence, as you all may remember, for instance, domestic violence cases by statute are required if the person is not detained to be cited in to the next day. And the emergency order issued by the Supreme Court allows for that. So any offenses involving domestic violence, either domestic assault or violation of abuse prevention orders, will be brought in. I'll say the next day, but generally speaking, 24 to 48 hours, depending on staffing. And also any offenses involving violence where the court is contacted for conditions of release, if they are not being lodged and the lodging detainee population has been substantially reduced. Those types of offenses generally will be brought in relatively soon, within 24, 48 hours, or certainly less than a week, so that in those offenses, the individual will have counsel assigned to them, and there can be a more deliberative approach to the appropriate conditions of release with input from state's attorneys, defense attorneys, and in the appropriate case, victims. So we are bringing some cases still into court, consistent with the administrative order, but obviously the traffic, in-person traffic in courts is extremely limited. And we're doing the best we can under those circumstances, but we recognize that certain cases have to come in. Relief from abuse orders are still being issued and still meeting the statutory time frames of coming in for final hearing within a week to 10 days. Juvenile emergency proceedings are still occurring, taking place. There's been a significant discussion of parent-child contact and how to address those issues. I testified yesterday in one committee, and I'll be testifying, I expect, in House Judiciary later today on that topic. We're struggling with those issues, as anyone can imagine, depending on the point of view, whether it's Department of Children and Families, whether you're a parent, with significant in-person parent-child contact, how that contact is being impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic is resulting in a number of cases coming into the family division, emergency cases on modification of parent-child contact. And I would say that's probably where we're seeing a lot of cases. And some of you may have heard bail review filings have gone up significantly because of the conditions that Commissioner Baker was referring to. So we, the judiciary, are seeing a lot of those motions. They tend to, many of them have a common theme of the conditions in the facilities relating to COVID-19 and the protocols that the department is issuing. And if I understood or recalled Commissioner Baker's comments, he's saying it's almost daily they update that protocol. So we're seeing a lot of those motions, and with reduced staffs, I have assigned had assigned one judge to hear those cases because of the common theme. By assigning the one judge, I certainly want it to be clear that we're not changing venue of those cases. The one judge is hearing those issues only relating to that request to modify or strike bail. But having said that, this situation is evolving, as all of you know. The numbers of those filings have increased dramatically. So I'm in the process of assigning a second judge to divide up that workload. And most of those hearings are being conducted remotely, either via video or telephone. There are very few, even when we have an in-person arraignment or a citation in court, it is rare to have a state's attorney and or a defense attorney physically appear in court, even for in-court proceedings. So the nature of these motions and the skeletal staffs and the ability to do a lot of this remotely is what lends itself to having one or two judges hear these cases. And if the numbers increase so that we need a third judge, then I will assign a third
Judge, can I ask a question
Sure.
about that process?
Sure.
Because I've had not a lot, but several emails from victims of crime concerned about their abuser or the person who harmed their family coming in for some type of process. And they feel like they have nowhere to go, nowhere to be heard. Is that accurate?
I've heard the same, Commissioner, excuse me, Senator. And my response has been, when I've been asked that question, is these proceedings aren't, other than the fact that they're being done remotely, which has its own complications, are not being done any differently than before the pandemic hit. In other words, when someone files a motion for review of bail that a victim may want to have a voice in, generally the court doesn't take on the responsibility of notifying the victim. Usually that would come through the local state's attorney's office. And by all means, the word should go out that if a victim wants input in whatever motion is before the court, they're entitled to have input. The question sometimes becomes, how do we get that voice into court? And that's what in part delays some of these proceedings, to make sure that the people that need to be heard or entitled to be heard have that access. And so it's a matter of getting everybody together at the same time and the same means, but certainly they're entitled to be heard.
Just realized I'm pointing at senators saying, go ahead, and I can't see who I'm pointing at. Senator Benning, you had a question.
Thank you. Judge, I have two questions. With respect to the COVID-19 related filings for modification of bail, have you, to the best of your knowledge, had any of those cases actually their requests granted?
The short answer is no. As far as I'm aware, there has been one decision issued by Judge Harris, actually up in your county, Senator, in Caledonia. This was, I'm going to say, time has been flying in this situation. I think about 2 weeks ago, motions came in before him. He took evidence remotely and issued a decision, but none have been granted yet.
Okay. My second question is with respect to relief from abuse cases, domestic assaults, and parent-child contact emergency requests. Have you seen an uptick in those categories?
I will say that we've seen an uptick in requests for modification of parent-child contact, both in the domestic side and as well as in the juvenile side. I was involved in a committee hearing yesterday, House Human Services, that focused on contact with children in the custody Department of Children and Families. And as some of you may know, the department has put in place a protocol attempting to modify in-person contact with parents for children who are placed in foster care to remote or virtual contact via Skype or some other mechanism. And I'll give you the numbers that I've heard, but they're certainly subject to Commissioner Schatz testifying. Approximately 900 families in custody. They've been able to get all but, as I understand it, roughly 30 families to agree to remote contact. So they have done a good job of explaining the issues to the families involved and getting consent from obviously by far the majority of families to agree to that. So there's a number that they haven't been able to agree upon, and those are the cases that are coming in to the court involving children in custody. The domestic situations, we're also seeing a fair amount of motions throughout the state because people are just unsure of how to react, for instance, to the governor's order, stay safe, stay home. But they may have a very robust parent-child contact schedule. It may be week to week. There are other schedules, obviously, that one parent may have by far the majority of parent-child contact, but the other parent still has maintained regular contact. And so those are the ones that we're seeing come in, because I think the parents are unsure of what that order means as it relates to the parent-child contact orders. I will say that the Department of Children and Families brought to my attention, or through me asked the Supreme Court if they would consider a blanket order denying in-person contact between parents with children in DCF custody, and the Supreme Court elected not to issue a blanket order, leaving it to the individual trial judges to handle those types of cases on a case-by-case basis, and we are seeing those. You also mentioned RFAs. I'll be testifying later today to another committee, I believe, on that subject. From what I've been able to gather in talking with the domestic violence folks, my understanding is there has not been an uptick in those filings, but I have also heard from individual counties, prosecutors say that they have seen it. So I'm not sure where the numbers are on that, but we're still seeing those, we're still hearing those and issuing orders. Many of them, again, are being done remotely. We have not mandated phone participation because in many cases, folks do not have phones. But many of the hearings are being done remotely.
Thank you.
Thank you. Other questions for Judge Gerson? Judge, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Keep in
I would
touch.
say, consistent with what you've been hearing from some of the other witnesses, the enforcement issues, stay at home. I've also assigned 3 judges in different parts of the state to address those issues if they do come up, so that we'll have judges ready to address those issues. And the other issue, just so the committee knows that we're struggling with and continue to work on, involves the mental health hearings. We're trying to do those remotely, and competency evaluations as well, which is a real stumbling block. But we continue to work with DMH and with the public defenders as well as state's attorneys in trying to come up with a system that will allow us to continue to monitor those cases. So
Thank you.
That's what I have.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it, Judge. And we'll probably be in touch next week sometime just to keep our contacts open. I don't know that we have specific legislation to look at, but we'll try to stay in touch.
Thank you.
thank you. Committee.
And I
can
have
we-
to go to another meeting, so I'm leaving. Thank you.
Figures. The good news is you just go from one Zoom to the next.
I zoom from one to the other. Yes, you're right.
Zoom from one to another. In
Thank
the
you.
Zoom world.
Yep.
The next subject is one that some of you may have not seen. Most of you live on the border, except for Senator Baruth, who has a ferry come across. I don't know if there's signs at the ferry dock, but it's the issue of the idea that people who come here to stay should quarantine. And when you've got and Secretary Flynn wrote me and suggested that the signs are so small that it's hard to put everything you'd want to know on them. So I guess I would start with Secretary Flynn about what's going on in our borders with the AOT trucks and AOT personnel and so forth.
Good morning, Senator Sears, and good morning, committee. For the record, Joe Flynn, Secretary of Transportation, and also in the meeting and available is Deputy Chief Engineer Ann Gamble. I can just start with sort of a high-level review of what it is we're doing, and then, take any questions that you might have. The effort that Senator Sears spoke about began on April 1st. We have primarily three goals, if you will, in this traffic monitoring that we're hoping to achieve. In no order of importance, the first is to try to determine as best we can how effective the COVID-19 mitigation measures such as stay home, stay safe might be reflected in traffic volume. So is that messaging working? The second really is to give Vermont healthcare leaders a sense of what future healthcare decision-making might need to happen, and obviously in concert with the governor. They talk a lot about flattening the curve, and yesterday we heard the governor say that it seemed to be indicating that the measures that Vermonters are taking into stride are possibly working in that regard. So this monitoring effort, again, is just an unscientific way to try to understand by the way we move, is that consistent? And then I think as importantly, or most importantly, if the signs that you mentioned, Senator Sears, the message that's actually on those boards is if you enter Vermont to stay, self-isolate 14 days. We are limited to the number of characters, we're limited to the copy. It's quite an art form, honestly, to try to come up with a message that makes sense when you're limited to it, whatever it is we're talking about. But in this case, that was the best we could. We couldn't get the word quarantine on the sign. It just didn't work. But so the point though is that it's not about the Vermonter who might go between White River Junction and Lebanon, to grocery shop, or come from Plattsburgh to go to UVM Med Center to work and back, or in your area, Senator Sears, who comes into the hospital in Bennington and goes back into New York, or in any other border area. But that particular sign was aimed at the people who have either been away from Vermont for a while and are returning. I think we all know people that may have gone south and now they've come home, or people that are coming here from someplace else to be with family during these uncertain times. And so it's real important that the message that's been consistent from the health department on a daily basis about quarantining yourself if you've been from away for 14 days at least is messaged. And that's what we're trying to do. I think it's very important to say that we are not targeting anybody. We are not targeting out-of-state vehicles. We are looking at every vehicle. We are absolutely not noting any license plate registration numbers. We simply are noting as best we can the origin of the license plate, the state, that's it, or the province. We are not using any license plate readers. If you see a DMV vehicle at any of these locations, they are making periodic visits, as are some state troopers, because we've had a couple of threats, quite frankly, out of Windham County toward some of our VTrans employees. These have been in-person physical threats, and that's very unfortunate. So we are just asking our own staff as they move around the state and do their jobs to swing into these locations from time to time. But there is no data that's being captured electronically. This is a pen to paper, clipboard, old fashioned exercise. All our folks have a sheet with the license plates of all the states, and they're just checking the ones that they see, and it's getting tallied up every day. This is a 24-hour operation. It began as 2 12-hour shifts, 8 hours straight, 4 hours overtime. By Sunday, we hope to have that to be 3 8-hour shifts. But we just stood it up so quickly that was the best way to do it when we started. As we speak this morning, there are 76 places in Vermont where there are signs crossing Vermont's borders. 38 of those 76 are staffed with VTrans personnel who are doing this monitoring that I described a moment ago. And of those 38, there are 7 locations where we're monitoring outbound traffic as well as inbound traffic. And the data sets that we're compiling, if you will, are obviously, the volume at that location, and then the volume at that location broken out by states of origin. We also, on a routine basis, can talk to our RWIS stations. You've probably seen those, the roadway weather information stations. There's,
Yep.
Yeah, you've got them down in Searsburg, and folks see them along Interstate 89, Interstate 91, Route 4, things like that. On an annual basis, those devices help us identify the annual traffic volume, and that is not a finite, perfectly scientific process, but it does allow us to do the best that we're able to do. And what we're seeing statewide right now, since within about 2 weeks, has been a decrease in overall traffic of about 52%.
Wow.
And unscientifically, if one assumes that commercial truck traffic is perhaps as voluminous as it was previously, because that's also part of the response, and we have to keep food and fuel and things moving, it would seem to indicate that the category that's not commercial truck traffic has probably significantly dropped below the 52%. We're seeing that obviously the highest volume crossing point is White River Junction on Interstate 89. Just interesting facts that we're seeing. There's 21% more vehicles entering Vermont than leaving Vermont at that, and it doesn't tell us anything. It doesn't mean that they're not leaving some other place, and there's no way to know that. And so some of this is, what do they say? There's facts and damn facts, and I don't know necessarily what we'll do with all this, but it's sort of interesting. And the least busy locations are Highgate and Derby Line on Interstates 89 and Interstates 91, because the Canadians are frankly taking an even tougher approach at the border than the Americans are. So that's not a surprise. We also have seen in this period 60% reduction in crashes, which makes sense. And it's more than 60% because not all crashes are immediately reported. You have 30 days to report a crash in Vermont. So assuming that they're not all reported yet, we're already seeing a 60% reduction. So, that's, again, it's just interesting information. But going back to the border monitoring, I think one of the other things that this is going to help us with as we start to come out the other end of this COVID is when we see the numbers we're seeing today, and as the governor said yesterday at the press conference, when we reach a point where we're able to start turning the spigot a quarter turn at a time, we will see those numbers start to lift. And I think we'll be able to sense the reverse of what we think we sense now is how effective has stay home, stay safe been. And as that eases and the spigot gets turned a quarter at a time, we should be able to see and sort of map, if you will, by traffic volume, that recovery, that planned, staged, recovery. So that's the picture, if you will, and I'm happy to have the conversation.
Yeah, Senator White has a question.
Thanks, Secretary Flynn.
She represents the area with the.
Yes.
Right. I was going to ask if you can talk about a little bit about the nature of what those threats were and were they Vermonters threatening, or were they people coming into the state who were threatening, and how did you handle them?
I don't know. It's a good question. I think one of them was a Vermont vehicle that pulled up. These both occurred. One occurred on Friday last week and one occurred Saturday, actually just moments after I was there. I went around and visited all these locations last weekend and kept my social distance. But the threats were, just sort of angry people that, in these two cases at least, that didn't understand what we were doing. They apparently, through social media, which can be your asset or your enemy, they thought that we were going to move the trucks across the roadway and block the borders, which is absolutely not true. And it's understandable. In the absence of information, we all fill the void. And so I can appreciate that to some degree, but when it turns into shouting and making, threatening accusations toward the employee, that's concerning. So we reported it to law enforcement, to your point, Senator. The second one that occurred last Saturday, I'm told, was actually a guy who roller skated up or on rollerblades and just started, shouting at the driver. And again, that this was, my town and you have no business doing this and we're different. We don't need to abide. And everybody's on edge and we understand that. But and it's certainly not widespread. I don't want to give the impression that it is widespread at this point. So our folks, we've told our folks, first of all, if you feel you need to, you can call 911. You can also just roll the window up in your truck and drive away. I mean, you're sitting in a truck. There's that safety barrier. We also, so on every vehicle, we have, just a 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper taped to the window facing outward, explaining everything, just the bullet points of what we're doing, and a contact information to call the JIC in Waterbury, which is really the center of all information for the COVID response. So we're doing our best. Actually, I observed too, the 18 locations that I visited last weekend, many vehicles driving by, honking and waving with all 5 fingers, just being somewhat supportive, I think. So again, I'm sure that there's a lot of consternation, period, amongst all of us regarding COVID and what it's done to our lives and our state and our nation.
Thank
I have
you.
a couple of questions. The first is why we're doing the outbound. We know they're assuming they're leaving because they're going out. And at 279, there were 2 huge plow trucks. So with people on both, I think there might have been 3 AOT employees, but I saw at least 2 with clipboards. And I wondered why we were doing the outbound.
Well, I think to my point a moment ago, when we're in White River, where we saw 21% don't appear to be leaving, I think we're just trying to gauge some sort of a sense of that. Okay. And part of the answer too, I believe, is certainly up here where I live, there is a daily ebb and flow across the Grand Isle Ferry. There's an ebb and flow down where you live on 279. Yep. There's absolutely an ebb and flow in White River, Norwich area going over to Hanover and Lebanon. I think we're trying to sense what that balance is.
A lot of people in Vermont, in the Bennington area anyway, move back and forth the state border. It's routine. They work in New York or they work in Vermont, and they live in Vermont or live in New York. I guess the question maybe for either any, Lisa, Leah, did you want to comment on this from the American Civil Liberties Union?
Sure. Thank you, Senator Sears. For the record, Leah Ernst, Senior Staff Attorney at the ACLU of Vermont. I appreciate the opportunity to talk to the committee today. The heading of the hearing was border checkpoints, and I have heard of no plan or intent to set up a checkpoint where vehicles would be stopped and questions. No. And I certainly hope that remains the case. And so most of my remarks were going to be directed at why we would oppose that and why that was a bad idea. And, you know, perhaps I need not even run through those remarks. But we would absolutely have plenty to say about that. With respect to, you know, the gathering of place of origin information of vehicles coming into and out of Vermont, you know, Secretary Flynn has given us some reasons for why that data is relevant and important and what it goes to. You know, just like everybody else, the ACLU of Vermont, of course, recognizes we're in extremely challenging times and that the greater good requires that we not engage in just business as usual. And, you know, with the understanding that some restrictions and changes are coming into effect, there are just some general ground rules that we believe they should all follow. One is that every restriction on people's liberties and movement, every increase in surveillance and monitoring must be scientifically justified by medical and public health officials and be the least restrictive means necessary to meet that end. Likewise, any such restriction or monitoring or surveillance must be continually reevaluated to ensure they remain justified and necessary in light of these rapidly evolving conditions. And finally, and I appreciate that Secretary Flynn referred to this, that any movement restriction or monitoring must not be implemented in a manner that discriminates in any way. And so in light of those three ground rules, you know, I personally haven't seen what these monitoring stations look like. I've barely left my house, as is true for a lot of us. You know, and Senator Sears referenced that they do feel intimidating, or that he could understand feeling intimidated by that.
Understand feeling.
Understand, excuse me. And, you know, I don't know if there are ways to set those up that are sort of feel less heavy-handed. Again, I'm not speaking on the basis of having seen one myself, so I apologize for any misunderstanding.
What I saw obviously is the larger trucks. I think if it was a pickup truck, it would be less. And I know some of the areas have pickup trucks rather than the large plow trucks, but I'm sure we don't have enough pickup trucks to cover. I'm sure that's the reason, but I think that was my impression. And I didn't say I was intimidated. I want to make that clear. I can see how somebody would be by that large with the flashing lights, as if you're coming up on something really awful. And obviously this is awful, but
and, you know, certainly with the rumors going around about blocking off roadways and everything else, you know, it's important that as in everything relating to responding to COVID-19, public education first. And so, you know, anything that can be done to assure people that we're not putting the borders on lockdown, we're not setting up checkpoints. And I also appreciate that you specifically and explicitly mentioned that you are not using automated license plate readers. That was something, you know, we've been hearing concerns about. And so I'm glad that we're able to assure people that that is not happening. And so, you know, I appreciate all the efforts you're making to make this as low impact on the traveling public, you know, those who do have a reason to be traveling. As you mentioned, we are all extremely under stress at this point, and anything we can do to mitigate the added stress, we would absolutely encourage.
You know, that actually one of the reasons the committee wanted to have this type of hearing was to at least get out in public what exactly is happening. And where that leads me is, David, have you got any comments from the Attorney General's Enforcement Division regarding the border?
To the AOT data gathering exercise, as that is just a data gathering exercise that really doesn't really dovetail with the enforcement issues. With respect to the I should say the one question we have been getting a little bit is the 14-day quarantine rule for those who are arriving from out of state.
Mhm.
And so that is something that we're dealing with on a case-by-case basis. And the governor's order does have a different definition of essential purpose for the purpose of that 14-day quarantine rule than the earlier order does for the more general essential business definition in the broader stay-at-home, stay-safe order. And so that's just something we're keeping in mind, trying to educate people about as well, is to say, look, if you're coming in from out of state, obviously medical workers and industry workers are essential, and there needs, keep on coming, doing your jobs. We need that to continue. But the sort of essential purposes around, for example, recreation and things like that, that is not included in the 14-day quarantine order with respect to emailing folks from out of state. And that's just something we're trying to educate about and make sure people understand. That's the only piece that we've been dealing with respect to the border crossing issue.
Actually, that's a great segue into the next witness, is Michael Snyder, Commissioner of Forest Parks and Recreation. Is somebody wants to come over the border to spend some time at one of our parks, just walking around, hiking, whatever. And how does that fit with, don't come to stay, but you're only coming to recreate for an hour? That's what I think that was the question we basically have, is how all the parks and recreation going to work.
Right. Yes, thanks. Happy to join and shed some light on this if I could. For the record, Michael Snyder, Commissioner of Forest Parks and Recreation. Thanks for the invitation. I'll start with Vermont State Parks. We are in the off season, which means that as ever, the parks are open to the public. They're just not staffed or operational. The facilities are closed, like bath facilities, they're not maintained. So, but that's as ever. People during the winter, people can come in and use the grounds. And that's still the case. Though we have suspended reservations per the order, and we have also suspended off-season camping, which is a tradition that people can, with 3 days notice, they can get a permit to go use the parks for camping during the off-season. We've suspended that. We're not taking any new reservations. We generally have 4 parks that open before Memorial Day. Jamaica State Park, owing to the West River Dam release and the race related to that, and a couple others. We have decided to delay those normally early opening parks indefinitely until we can have a better handle on where things are. And though we generally shoot for the Memorial Day opening with full operations, we are planning the various scenarios to try to open on time if circumstances suggest that that's appropriate. More and more that's seeming not to be the case. And so we're also planning other scenarios for a delayed opening or perhaps no operations, though we have wastewater systems and drinking water systems, et cetera, in the parks, and some facilities, cottages, cabins that could, in a worst case scenario, become assets for the state in response. So we want to be geared up and ready to make those available for public health and safety as may be needed for isolation places or for housing of medical personnel, who knows. So we've been working very hard to be prepared for a multitude of different outcomes possibly, but for the purposes of this conversation, we're still at parks are, the land is open, the facilities are not, and that includes gating some roads and trails, largely consistent with what we would normally do this time of year owing to mud season concerns. But now with people wanting to be outside a bit, get some exercise and fresh air, we know the health benefits associated. We are seeing a crush of activity at certain parks. And so we're having to respond to that because with some closures of facilities and signage, importantly, because our staff are not able to, under the order, to go out and do what they would normally do in the way of prep or maintenance or interacting with the public to manage that use. So Because we can't do the responsible management of the use, we are in some cases starting to ratchet down and close certain the access. But with the general philosophy that we want to keep the lands open, if not all facilities. So we've also we've locked all the bath facilities and we have removed all the portalets where we use those, except in 2 high pressure parks in Chittenden County, Mount Philo and at Niquette Bay, where we have we're going to continue to use portalets, sanitizing them under CDC protocol twice a day at significant expense. But there's such pressure for those places that we're going to try to hang in there and keep that going. But otherwise, we've put signs everywhere advising on best practices and precautions, and trying to help people understand that, it's good to use them, but both for human health, public health, and for land health, people need to act accordingly and appropriately. So that's a quick overview on state parks. I can broaden out to our approach to more trail-based recreation, non-trail-based recreation, and if you'd like, but maybe I'll pause there. Are there specific questions?
Senator White has a question, I think.
Sure.
You have to unmute yourself, Senator White.
Thank you. I muted myself. Well, anyway, because I tried to tell Joe that he had gone over to the dark side and that the side of his face it showed looked a little bit like the new moon. So I was busy emailing him.
I don't know where it is, what's doing where you folks are, but right now it's very dark and very stormy in Lindenville.
Yes. Okay. So I saw he turned on his lights, but so Michael, I've had a number of concerns from people, particularly up in the Jamaica area, that and while people feel that it's really necessary to allow people to access the parks for recreation, because some people don't have the ability where they live to go for walks, that there's a lot of concern about people, because we're so close to borders, people are coming for day trips, and that they are concerned, and they don't want to turn it into a they versus us, but there is a lot of concern about people coming up for day trips and using the facilities and then stopping along the way. So are we doing anything about that, or is there anything to do? Thank you.
It's a good question, and I've received some incoming as well from some of your constituents. I also heard from Senator Ballant on a similar concern related to Jamaica and Hamilton Falls in particular. Responded to that. But one thing I left out in the general parks, our approach to managing parks right now, is that we are very grateful to Fish and Wildlife and Commissioner Porter and Colonel Batchelder. They've agreed to add extra detail for the warden force in making rounds to our state parks. Although Commissioner Porter could speak to this better, but as I understand it, their guidance is to really avoid person-to-person contact. But so they're doing it by making rounds, sort of kind of a showing up and being present, but also reporting back to our staff about inappropriate behavior or damage, so that we can make kind of specific limited stealth visits to deal with it. But they also have been effective in stopping some illegal behavior and also just in education and talking with folks from a distance. And we greatly appreciate that. So that's another layer that we've added here with thanks to the warden force from Fish and Wildlife. And beyond that, we are doing a fair amount on social media and our website and engaging with traditional news media and getting the message out and just trying to help people understand that, like we've said, yes, it's good and important to get out locally, but we're asking people to do that very locally, less than 10 miles.
Yeah,
and in some cases, that will include some guests from out of state. It raises the question of, well, when you come from out of state, you're supposed to self-isolate. I'm heartened to hear that that's sort of seen as a little bit differently for recreation. I'd like to think that we can manage this by spreading the word and having sort of peer-to-peer understanding of what's appropriate and what's not. And I think, we certainly don't have any enforcement ability or authority, and are just trying to do our best with good messaging and helping people understand. I will throw in one interesting point came to me from checking in with the supervisor of the National Forest. They're struggling with some similar, and he was asking how we're approaching it and seemed grateful for some insights. But he raised a point of the through hikers on the Appalachian Trail entering the state on foot, and technically, therefore, needing to self-isolate. The facilities, privies, mulching, composting toilets, etc., cabins, huts, they're all closed, but the trail is, and we're asking people to stay off the long trail. But we know through hikers are going to start coming through, particularly the northbounders. And we are thinking about how to put up signs and ask people to be respectful of the order as they enter the state on foot, which I don't think any of us really contemplated prior. Senator White, I hope that's addressing your concerns and telling you what we are doing, what we understand we can do, and I'm certainly open to doing more or other if you all have ideas and suggestions.
Okay, well, our Wyndham County delegation will meets on every Saturday, and we'll talk about this. Thank you.
Sure.
You're lucky that your delegation meets.
Every Saturday.
Good for you. I should probably join you. I represent Wilmington,
Yeah.
I don't know if Ann Gamble had anything to add to the AOT discussion, but I really appreciate you staying in there. Are there any other questions for any of the witnesses that we've had this morning? Actually, this has been extremely helpful to me anyway in answering many of my constituents' concerns. And Secretary Flynn, David, Leah, and Commissioner Snyder, thank you so much for joining us.
You bet.
Thank you.
Stay
Thank you.
well.
Take good care.
Yep. Is there anything else for committee at this point? We'll probably try to meet next week and hopefully get out good notice. I'm thinking more like Wednesday or Thursday, depending upon what the Senate schedule is.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
How
Peggy,
did it go on the
thanks
Senate
as
floor
always.
today?
Michelle, thank you. Stay healthy. Bye now.
Yes, everybody.